Tonight, an Anzac special, an extended treatment of a program first screened in 1995.
There seems to be an air of unreality, as though the war were a million miles away. It's not. It's just outside our door now.
This vision is from Australian cinematographer Damien Perra's 1942 Academy Award-winning documentary. To Perra's dismay, Kokoda Frontline was originally edited in a manner unfaithful to the facts. Tonight's account makes authentic use of Perra's remarkable footage to tell the story as he saw it.
Shock, man.
That's sure.
They have walked through a battlefield designed by the devil, past grave sites of their forefathers known only to God.
Well done, Benny. On your Benny, boy. Smile. Bit of sweat happening here. Just have a look.
First I thought they would have problems, but when we got through, they didn't have much problem coming across.
I think when I got here, Tower's Corner, it just made me realise just how close they got.
Oh, it's something that I think I'll always remember. Something really hard that I think I know I can do something hard again, because I've done this.
The men who fought the Japanese and the Kokoda track in 1942 were not far from children themselves. The average age was Jack Manole's age, 21.
Yeah, well, at one stage I remember looking around at my few mates in the section, and they were yellow-skinned and the eyes back, dirty, scruffy lot. And I thought, Christ, there's no one between us and Moresby. And if the Japs get through us and get to Moresby, Australia's gone.
I think youth under those circumstances was a blessing, because you could always laugh. You could always have a laugh at yourself.
This is the village of Kokoda. In the 1940s, this was Australian territory. We weren't just threatened with invasion, but desperately resisting it. A series of battles fought around here in the latter months of 1942 are not as well known as those at Gallipoli and Tobruk, even though these battles directly threatened the security of Australia.
One for you, you're very pretty. One for you. Come on, big smile.
It was as if our duty to our past and the security of others eclipsed our duty to ourselves, our own world, our own future. There were many more battles where many more Australian lives were lost. There were other battles where the actions of Australians helped alter the course of distant wars. But the battles that were fought around here have no equal in our history, because here Australians fought largely alone in defence of our own territory. The stories of the men who saved Australia should be retold, should be well known, not just because they are so utterly remarkable, but because they tell us so much about what ordinary Australians can do.
I can remember thinking at one stage, you know, who's that bloke, you know, moaning like that? That sounds dreadful. And I sort of took a bit of a check and found it was me.
I struck this Japanese officer, And when he broke through the Q&I, we were face to face with each other, and I think he was just as bloody scared as I was, and I was just lucky that I could bloody pull the trigger first. Anyway, that was an experience that I wouldn't like to ever handle again, because that haunted me for years. When I went through this bloke's equipment, and that was part of my job, I found he had photographs of himself and his wife and 3 little kids.
The village of Kokoda has given its name to a skinny track between here and Port Moresby, which we called at the time, in deference to our American allies, the Kokoda Trail.
I gave it the name, but not the fame. The fame was given by all these very brave fellows on both sides.
If they'd taken Port Moresby, this would have been a key position in dominating the Coral Sea. They could have, certainly would have moved their planes into Port Moresby. They could have bombed Northern Australia, and it would have made it extremely difficult to maintain those communications with America.
Most of Australia's best equipped and best trained soldiers were at the time of the Japanese invasion upholding the Anzac tradition on the other side of the world.
It was an historic day late in March 1942 when General Douglas MacArthur, a worldwide figure renowned for his driving force and brilliance as a leader, arrived in Canberra.
Then as now, Australia was not strong enough to defend itself.
He left Manila Bay in a torpedo boat accompanied by...
Australian Prime Minister John Curtin urged the return of our surviving troops, but having done so, allowed control of them to pass to the American General Douglas MacArthur, who'd also just now arrived ahead of the Japanese. General Thomas Blamey had just been appointed Australian Commander-in-Chief. There were serious doubts about the ability of both leaders. Blamey and MacArthur made a desperate choice in keeping what experienced soldiers we had in Australia. But these were desperate times. By May 1942, the Japanese had invaded Guadalcanal in the Solomons, and a convoy on the way to capture Port Moresby was only just turned back by the Americans in the Coral Sea.
I think Australia panicked. Australia considered that New Guinea, Port Moresby, was expendable, that we may well lose Northern Australia, the area around Townsville, or perhaps we might lose the Sydney, Wollongong, Newcastle area. We panicked, our politicians panicked.
We had sent north as our first line of defence, our last line of troops. The militia was made up largely of young conscripts. They were often disdained by the public and their older brothers in the AIF who'd volunteered for service. The militiamen were known as chocos, or chocolate soldiers, and had been conscripted on the understanding that they would be the home defence force. Instead, experienced soldiers were held back and the chocos hurried north. The New South Wales Militia Battalion, the 53rd, was probably the unluckiest of the lot. To make up the numbers, many were press-ganged onto the ship.
These blokes were started to be marched on. I think they were more or less under some sort of guard or other, because they were just, and they were objecting, I'm sure, and there were women screaming out to their husbands or brothers or something or other. And, this went on for hours at night. They drove you mad. But we found out afterwards they were taken out of their house at home that day, that morning, and marched to probably a camp and then straight onto the boat.
Did you feel you had a responsibility to go up and defend Australia?
Not at that time. Not at that time, because there were a number of AIF blokes still in Australia that could go and do it. They volunteered, and I didn't.
After arriving in Port Moresby, the boy soldiers of the militia were used as labourers before being pushed off on the greatest endurance course of all.
Oh my God, that walking. The first half an hour I thought, no, I'll never do this. I was exhausted, but I didn't like to show it to anyone, particularly to the country blokes, because they were going along all right. And after he got to Uberry, I was absolutely stonkered.
Allied military intelligence knew of the Japanese invasion plans for the north coast of New Guinea before they occurred. But ignorance and complacency clouded perceptions of the strength of the Japanese and the brute force of the Owen Stanleys. The Australians were told they could walk to the top and take command of a narrow gap where a platoon of men could hold off an army. The so-called narrow gap was as wide as the Hunter Valley.
Trying to stop an advancing army under those circumstances was a bit like being a half-back on a football field in the middle of the night when you couldn't see the enemy because he could go all around you, he could go anywhere.
The Australians were told they faced a small Japanese labour force. This small force was some 13,000 strong, equipped with long-range weapons like mountain guns. They were well camouflaged too. A common Australian complaint was they could not see the enemy.
I looked down the track and I seen this bush move. It was probably 75 yards away, and well, that's funny, a bush moving like that.
The fighting at Kokoda began late in July, days after the Japanese landing. For the next month, fewer than 500 men from the Victorian 39th Militia Battalion resisted 13,000 Japanese. The Australians' largest weapon was one obsolete First War machine gun. They withdrew from Kokoda through the rubber plantations towards the foothills of the range. Their khaki uniforms, perfect for the desert, caught the light in the deep green jungle. They improvised a camouflage dress and camouflage skills, and in time began to fade into the distant hills. By mid-August, the 39th Militia Battalion had withdrawn to a strong natural defensive position on one side of the gap at Ishurava. On the other side, at Abuari, was the New South Wales 53rd Militia Battalion. Some members of the 53rd did not even know how to assemble, let alone use their light machine guns. Late in August, the militia dug in before the Japanese.
Anyway, they'd play a bugle call. Oh, Jesus, then they'd come with the bayonet, you know. Some of them, on the odd occasion, got through our lines and stabbed blokes through the shoulder, and one bloke got stabbed through the cheek with a bayonet. Anyway, you'd hold them off. And then after a while they'd pull back, and then there'd be another bugle call and another lot would come in. And later we found out that there were 4 battalions of them against us, and we were at that time down to about 300 or so men. That was all that was left.
By now, at last, the AIF had been sent from Australia and were on their way to relieve the embattled 39th. One day's march from the front line at Myola, an ancient volcano crater, they were held up waiting for supplies they needed to take them into battle.
We left the base originally with six days' rations per man, and by the time we got to Myola, that was the 5th day. And what happened to the rations that were supposed to be there for us, nobody's ever been able to satisfactorily explain.
One explanation for the delay was a costly blunder back at Moresby. A Japanese air raid in mid-August had destroyed 28 Allied planes left lined up like sitting ducks. Footage by Damien Pera was censored. So was a damning report by the ABC correspondent who accompanied him, Chester Wilmot. Eventually, some remaining planes were put aloft, and the so-called biscuit bombers rained their supplies on Myola. While the supplies were at last sent, they came with no sense of urgency. The AIF was not told to hurry as they loaded up for the onward journey.
Well, we all started off with handy things. Wasn't so much food, it was handy things like clothing, like a dry pair of socks that would have been lovely to put on at night. But there was no night, and we just had to throw the socks away.
The Victorians, the 2nd 14th, were the first to move off. As they approached Ishirava, they could hear the fighting up ahead. Their young brothers in arms of the Victorian militia had held off the Japanese for 4 days and were within hours of being overrun.
There's no standing up and cheering, you know. We didn't have any cheers left in us, but I think those of us that prayed said a little prayer of thanks when they arrived. It was so good to see them. Better than Santa Claus.
We thought of them as, you know, as gods, people from another land. They were fit and tanned, you know, and I looked around at the boys, at my mates, and gee, their eyes were sunk back in their heads. They were dirty and unshaven. And that was then that I thought, we'll survive.
The fighting here at Ishirava saw Australians stand together against the Japanese, according to one account, with the buffet of fist and boot and rifle butt, and the steel of crashing helmets and of straining, strangling fingers. It's true that some militiamen, dispirited and disorganised, fled away from battle, back along the track, but others, beyond exhaustion, turned to face the Japanese. One experienced infantryman coming into the line along this track to reinforce the militia said, "When I saw those poor bastards tottering on their bleeding, swollen feet, turn and go straight back to Ishirava, I knew they were good."
No one asked them to go back. No one ordered them to go back, but they went back. They were the 39th.
On the day we attacked, we had advanced and there was less than 200 meters between us and a young Australian soldier. He was naked on top, wearing only his shorts, holding a grenade. He ran towards us and threw the grenade. Even the Japanese army would not have the courage to commit such an act.
One man later said of the fighting that everyone up there could have won a Victoria Cross. The honour went to a 2nd 14th Victorian, Private Bruce Kingsbury. He was fighting alongside this man, Bob Thompson.
There were probably 20 to 30 chaps milling around. They were shouting, screaming, giving orders to each other, and or their officers giving them orders. And they were firing at us, of course.
Overrun and trapped by the enemy, Kingsbury raced forward with his Bren gun, clearing a path through the enemy back to their own lines.
Anyway, Bruce was firing his Bren gun from the hip, and that's a very difficult thing to do. And he's firing it very well indeed. He was a great soldier, and with very good result too. He brought down a lot of them. As we got through just to the other side of this bit of a clearing, there was a small hill, and we stopped because there were two of our chaps up on top of it. They'd been up there cut off and been surrounded by the Japanese. And we stopped to talk to them to find out what they were doing, really. And Bruce was killed. Which is, I blame myself, because I should never have stopped.
But you weren't to know?
No. I should never have stopped though, just the same.
The 2nd 14th described the collision with the Japanese like hitting an express train. The jungle was red with the blood of both armies. Over all the fighting, the 2nd 14th had the heaviest casualties. 119 killed and 137 wounded.
It was either bullets or shrapnel, I'm not sure, got me in the legs from the rear. And at the same time as that happened, I got one in the hand, through here, and another one in... I thought I was dying for a moment. I had so much blood around. And then I asked somebody to wipe my face for me and tell me what was the trouble.
The Victorian positions at Ishirava were on the left flank of the fighting. Guarding the other side of the track was the New South Wales 53rd Militia Battalion, who were in trouble before the fighting even began. The failure of the 53rd to properly patrol the higher ground over the ridge at Abuari cost them dearly.
So I went back to the chappie who was leading the two of us, and he said, I'm not going down, and he didn't go down.
Unaware of the enemy's presence, their senior officers were struck down in an ambush.
Well, for us, we just resumed what we were doing. That was practically nothing, just wandering around.
When the Japanese made their main attack, the reluctant soldiers of the 53rd, leaderless and even more dispirited, fled over the side of the ridge.
They ran right through us and right to the trail, and they pulled up at the trail. And most of us didn't have rifles or packs or anything else near them, and so they went over the side, and I grabbed my pack and rifle, and I went over the side.
In shambled retreat, they headed back to Moresby, and by the time the West Australian 2nd 16th moved in to take over their positions, the Japanese had gained the higher ground.
Mick was probably 5 yards to the left of me. This was the first time when I got behind this little narrow tree that I thought I could shelter behind, and Mick opened up with his Tommy gun, and a sniper got him, and Mick just said, they got me bowies, and Mick was dead.
Australian headquarters was urging their men to go on the offensive, but the local commander of Maroubra Force, as it was known, Brigadier Potts, and the 39th Battalion's Ralph Honour saw the futility of this and withdrew from Ishirava to fight again. Within earshot of the front line was the medical aid post at Eora Creek.
I think that's where he got a signal from Blamey. Said to keep up the good work, tired Australians fight best. And that produced a reaction.
Also at Eora Creek, with the man who was taking these pictures, Damien Pera, was the ABC correspondent, Chester Wilmot. Wilmot was anxious to report the truth of the position, so rushed back to Port Moresby. His unpublished account says the retreat would not have happened if enough troops and equipment had been sent in time.
The Japanese had given themselves 10 days to reach Port Moresby. They'd also given their troops very small quantities of food. They were working on the theory that they would be able to capture our stores, our supplies, that they would annihilate our force very quickly. The startling achievement of Maroubra Force is that it was able to take on an enemy that outnumbered them 5 to 1, and I think it is to rather the seeds for the Japanese defeat on the Kokoda Trail was sown.
One triumph of the Kokoda story is the ingenuity of the methods devised there and then to wear out the Japanese. The other was the superhuman effort to evacuate the wounded. At Eora Creek, Dr. Bill McLaren treated some wounds he suspected were self-inflicted, but most were from the maul of battle.
Now this staggers you. Nobody groaned, moaned, or they didn't scream with pain or anything else. All they wanted to know is whether they had a homer.
A home wound?
Yeah, a wound to get them home. You see, a homer, Doc, what they'd say. Mm-hmm. But they never complained.
Back in the bush, weakened by the wounds, too far from the aid post and the Papuan bearers, were other parties of men.
He was badly wounded. We couldn't even talk to him much. And we were struggling along, so we only had 7. So it affected the rotation, 4 and 4. But that night, we slept on the track somewhere in the jungle. Not on the track itself, but back where we could keep it in sight, in the mine. And I could see something glistening in the moonlight. There was moonlight night. And I went down to have a look and sneaked down a bit. There was a tin of IXL blackberry jam. Most beautiful stuff I've ever tasted in my life. Second only to the cup of tea from Albert Moore that I got later on. So we opened up our bonus and scooped it out in handfuls and ate it with a biscuit. And the poor bloke died that night. And although I'm ashamed to say it, in my heart, and I fairly think, although no one said it, we weren't sorry.
Most of the wounded were shot in the legs and couldn't walk. There was a couple walking wounded, but these are the 4, and Medicine was shot in the ankle. Johnny said, and we said, well, we'll be able to get you. And he said, no way, I can crawl. And he got himself blankets and he put the blankets on his hands and his knees, and with a bullet through his ankle, he crawled, because we decided to go down the side of the mountain.
We picked up a straggler right into the jungle. How he ever got there, I don't know, but he was I would say a deserter from the 53rd Battalion. And the 53rd there weren't very popular with us, but he had no arms. We were quite well armed, our 9. I think we had 2 Brens and a Tommy gun there, and the others were Lee Enfield 303s. But we were all armed, and he had no arms. But the main thing, we weren't worried so much about the arms. What rations you got? And he said nothing. So another mouth to feed, and we had to think twice whether we'd take him with us.
He had a Jap bullet, a huge thing, about as big as the end of my finger. It would have been a heavy machine gun bullet. and it had lobbed in his bag. But Russ wouldn't go without leaving me, and he treated me like a baby. He got me food when I needed it, and so on. And then, wherever we were, he'd pull me up and stop me from falling over. That was Russ Fairburn.
The boys, their wounds were, the maggots had got to them, and we worked it out that the maggots might be a very good thing to keep the wounds clean instead of, but I was talking to them, one of them, he said, well, Charlie, he said, you have maggots crawling on your wound. He said, it's driving me mad. And we said, well, we're doing our best. He said, I know that, but he said, it's hell.
Eventually able to carry them no further, the wounded in Charles Butler's party stayed with the medical orderly in a friendly native village. After 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, the rest of the party reached their own lines. They later learned the men they were forced to leave behind had been butchered by the Japanese. It was a common fate for captured Australians.
They were savages, but, you know, they were still good bloody soldiers. But they were savages, there's no doubt about that.
I'm not sure that they expected any difference from us. I'm not sure.
Later, Australians did take Japanese prisoners, but at this stage of the fighting, there was no mercy.
We heard all this screaming, yelling going on, which I often wondered whether they did this to boost their own spirits or to frighten the hell out of the blokes that they're going to have a go at. But one of our blokes responded with a Tarzan call. It was even funny at the time, and as he did, they opened fire and they cleaned a lot of them up.
Through the first days of September, the Australians continued their fighting withdrawal, the AIF protecting the 39th, who reached the village of Minari by September 6. After 7 weeks of fighting, the exhausted militia battalion had lost 125 men, its ranks depleted by 1/4. South Australian soldiers from the 2nd 27th moved up into the line to replace them. The 39th Commander, Colonel Ralph Honour, saw the nobility of the moment and called to parade the men who were described by the relieving AIF as those ragged, bloody heroes.
I can't remember his exact words. I can't quote him verbatim. But I'll always remember what he meant and what he implied when he said you're all Australians. And some things you've just been through you must forget. Some of the men that were with you feel might have let you down, but they didn't. It's given different circumstances, they'd be just the same as you, and they are just the same as you. The fact that their leaders may have failed them, and yours didn't, doesn't mean they're any better or any worse than you are.
On the very same day, Ralph Honour was thanking his ragged, bloody heroes over the hills there at Minari. General MacArthur was expressing a different view. The Australians are unable to match the enemy in jungle fighting. Aggressive leadership is lacking, he said. But MacArthur was wrong. The sensible Australian commanders in the field had no wish to stretch their troops beyond the limit of the thin supply line, and supply was causing the gravest concern. A day before the Minari parade, the Australians were forced to abandon the Myola dropping site to the advancing Japanese. The biscuit bombers were reduced to hit and miss runs like this one over Minari.
The Japanese had about 5,000 to 6,000 fighting in the mountains. Most of the troops they sent to Papua were fighting troops. They didn't send a large number of base support type troops. Whereas the Australians had something in the order of 2,000 troops fighting in the mountains. So at the point where it mattered, the Japanese outnumbered the Australians.
Just forward of Minari, at a place called Afogi on September 7, the day after the parade, the Japanese massed by night for their next major assault.
The Japs moved for several hours down the opposite side of the Afogi River, like a great glowworm moving for several hours down the side of this very extensive hillside.
It looked like a Christmas parade or something, and it was the most frustrating thing we could see. If we'd had a Vickers machine gun even, we could have reached them. We had nothing.
The 2nd 27th South Australian Battalion, that had been held in reserve, was now brought in alongside the Victorian and West Australians. But Brigadier Potts still had strength enough only to slow rather than stop the enemy. Keith Norrish was one of the West Australians to go out to meet them. In the rush to leave, he stuffed by chance a wad of letters and a steel mirror in his top pocket.
Ozzy Osborne was on my right, and we had been moving in unison. When he was moving, I was stationary. When I was stationary, he was moving. And we kept an eye on each other, and he stopped quite suddenly and was trying to clear his gun, and then put his head down and dived. And as he dived and as he hit the ground, there was a gun was fired, and his tin hat flew off and had a great hole in the back of it. And I was quite sure that he was dead. And sort of without telling worries, the logical thing to do was to continue the way that I was doing and come round behind the two people in that gun pit and dispatch them, which I did. The track actually went round this tree and then down the hill, and I was able to step in behind this blade, and when the bugle call was played, Japs got up in ones and twos and came belting down the track past me. Well, the fellow with the haversack was fairly easy to dispatch, and I thought that the next thing was the man with the gun. Well, every time that I hit him, he would sort of hunch up and back down the track and swing his gun back again, which he didn't ever get right back onto me because I was covering him, and every time he moved, every time I hit him, he would hunch up.
Jim Moyer could not see Keith Norrish, even though they were only metres apart.
I think anyone who's been shot from close range with a bullet would know it's almost incredible the force that it hits you with. That fortunately for me, I fell into a bit of a depression, and I know I said to myself, God, fancy dying in a place like this, because I knew I was a bit of a mess. It got me in the hip and come out through the front.
In the same few minutes, Norrish, also surrounded, fought off 8 or 9 Japanese before running out of ammunition.
I threw my leg over the log and grabbed Osborne by the webbing and pulled him in closer and took a box magazine off and banged it on the gun. And I was still leaning over, and there was one shot fired which hit me across the back of the left hand, and I didn't know where it came from. And the prospect was to flop back over the log into a one-man wall with one magazine, which seemed to be pretty silly when there were 3 in his other pouch. So I reached right out over the log as far as I could reach and fastened my hands around the magazines, and as I started to withdraw them, an unholy wallop, a blast from the front. It was, just in front of my knee. It wouldn't have been more than 18 to 20 inches away from me, the muzzle of the gun, which was dug in under the log I had my leg over. And the 4 bullets struck the mirror, struck the shirt pocket area, went through them, through the correspondence, and buckled the mirror, and that tipped over. And the shock of the fire, you know, when a rabbit's shot, the way it leaps, you may or may not know, but when an animal is shot, a rabbit in particular, the way it leaps, I now know why that happens, because that propelled me. It was like being hit by a train.
By now, his mate, Jim Moyer, had been found and carried out by a stretcher bearer. The wound through his groin was too large for a field dressing.
They put me on this homemade stretch, and he said, "Don't worry, Jim," he said, "you won't get left, we won't leave you here," which you knew, not that I could do anything about, but you knew that he was the sort of bloke that wouldn't. And shortly afterwards, my elder brother, who was also in B Company, they pulled a stretch, they pulled a blanket over me completely, right over my head at the time. I suppose it was probably because so I wouldn't see how bad things were and how close the Japs were. And I heard a voice say, "I believe you've got the young bloke here." That was me. And they said, "Yeah, he's under the blanket." So I suppose he probably thought, well, he must have, you know, had it if he's under the blanket, so he pulled the blanket up. We just gave him the sign. He said, "No, you're okay." I said, "Oh, more or less." And he had to go, like he was on his way again.
I didn't lose consciousness, but I think I lost track of time for a while. But the left arm didn't work very well, and I started hemorrhaging from the lung, which was a bit disconcerting because it meant that the whole of my nose and the mouth was sort of surrounded by pink froth like a beard, and breathing wasn't all that easy anyway. I had to keep my ribs still, so it was virtually a matter of puffing my cheeks out to blow the froth away, to suck a bit of air in. And it was quite extraordinary. But some minutes after that, the people who were going to sort of follow us up, the fellow in charge of the platoon that came right up next to me, he wouldn't have been more than 10 or 15 feet behind me, I assume from his voice. And he said, "Just hold on here, you fellows. I think the best thing we can do is just quietly pull out." And I'd had a section of blokes for whom I couldn't account for any, and that's what got me on my feet. I felt a bit angry, and I sort of got myself to my feet and confronted this bloke and told him that I thought that, you know, the attack should go on, not be stopped. And Bill O'Keefe, one of our stretcher bearers, turned up at that time and took my Tommy gun from me and said,
He said, "You've done enough."
Yeah.
And you had.
The men described the Papuan carriers as combining the care of a nurse and the love of a mother. They also helped the walking wounded, like Keith Norrish, who struggled along for 5 days with 4 bullets in his chest.
I worked it out that I had to take little short steps, which meant that on account of the breathing, which meant that I had to be very careful where I put my feet. I couldn't put them on a slippery surface without first putting the staff down to steady it, and I realised that there was nobody moving as slowly as I was.
Norrish's battalion in the Victorian 2nd 14th managed to keep ahead of the Japanese, but not so the South Australian 2nd 27th.
We were cut off. We only had enough ammunition for about 20 minutes fighting anyway by this stage. And we had those 15, 18 stretcher cases to look after, which John Byrne was going to control.
Colonel Cooper, in his great wisdom, decided that in the breakthrough at Afogi, whatever else happened, he was going to bring out his battalion intact, and he was going to bring out his wounded.
John Burns had never met Jim Moyer before that moment. Despite the serious danger, he and a mate, Alf Zanker, didn't hesitate in agreeing to stay with the wounded.
I mean, we know what they did to a lot of the others. They beheaded them or tied them up to a tree and used them for bayonet practice.
With their 7 stretcher cases, Burns and Zanker toiled to keep them alive and moving in the trackless, pitiless bush.
Yes, well, it's a miracle, of course. Our modern disciples. Our withdrawal, parallel to the rest of the brigade, but with the anticipation of joining them to make a real blockage, excuse me, was slowed down to such a degree that we were out there for nearly a fortnight without any food.
It was common for men to lose a quarter of their body weight. There was only one comfort stop on the Kokoda track, the Salvation Army post.
And there it was, the old hop-in sign, and it was almost unbelievable. Wasn't all that far from the Malay, you know, and there they were. And he offered us a boiling hot cup of tea, harness, milk, coffee, biscuits, packet of 3 threes of 9 for 6pence cigarettes, and some chocolate. Unforgettable. That's marvellous, the pleasures you get out of simple things when you desperately need things. So they've never had any trouble getting a quid off me, those blokes.
On September 12, 6 days after the start of the Battle of Ofogi, the Japanese had reached the final ridge lines before Port Moresby. From Iori Baiwa, they could see the searchlights of Moresby at night. From here, as you can see, it was a downhill run. As the Japanese threatened to spill down these slopes, concern intensified within the Australian Parliament. General Blamey was ordered to Port Moresby to take personal control.
What's happening, you see, is this going to be another Singapore? To a certain degree, the politicians would have been on his back, and he knew there was concern in Australia, nervousness. Some have described it as near panic. I don't think it was as bad as that.
We know that in the Advisory War Council, the members of both the government and the opposition were extremely concerned about what was happening in New Guinea, fear that the generals were not fighting the battle properly, and then this was fuelled by MacArthur telling the Australians, particularly the Australian politicians, that the Australian soldiers, their generals, were not doing their job properly.
Blamey arrived at a time when at last fresh reinforcements and heavy weapons were being moved forward. The Australians fighting withdrawal, seen in Canberra as a retreat, had also by now worn down the Japanese strength by 1/2.
At Iori Baiwa, we received a command saying we should retreat. Our morale dropped when we were told to retreat.
We called it advance backwards, and at that time, we began to retreat.
The Japanese were turned around, not so much here, but by America's distant successes at Guadalcanal and much closer, Australia's victory at Milne Bay, which forced Japan to postpone its plans to seize Port Moresby. Before Iori Baiwa, many Australians thought the Japanese would not run, but with the momentum of their attack gone, aggression and discipline was scattered among the kunai grass. A Japanese correspondent wrote that after the moment of truth of retreat had arrived, each tried for his life to flee faster than his colleagues.
They were in no condition at Iori Baiwa really to capture Port Moresby. Maroubra forces fighting withdrawal had cost them time. Time was the key on the Kokoda Trail. Every day you spent on that trail, every day that victory didn't come, was going to cost you sickness casualties, it was going to cost you battle casualties, and it was a misery. The Japanese that swarmed over the Iori Baiwa feature were finished.
Finished also were Potts and the Moresby commander, Rowell. Potts had demonstrated inspired disobedience in winning the withdrawal instead of following orders and losing the advance. His reward was to be removed as swiftly as possible. In later letters to his wife, he called the action a piece of moral cowardice from higher up. He said the dismissal was political, explaining that scalps had to be produced and his was demanded.
He'd whittled away the Japanese force till it was weakened, and he kept his troops, kept Port Moresby protected by keeping his troops ahead of the Japanese and between them and Port Moresby. He expected to be congratulated, I think, upon what he'd done.
So why wasn't he?
Because I think very high command had to make a show of being dramatic, forceful, and producing the right drive to force the Australian troops to go ahead and destroy the Japanese. I suggest for personal promotion reasons.
The ABC correspondent was another who believed Blamey was wrong and that Australians, including the Prime Minister, did not know the truth of what had happened on the Owen Stanleys. Wilmot set about making the appointment of his life. The 31-year-old reporter took his concerns about Blamey to Canberra. In the second week of October 1942, Chester Wilmot met with Prime Minister Curtin, who expressed a different view. He said he was aware of Wilmot's criticisms and seriously worried about them, but that the record of General Blamey in predicting the enemy's movements had been faultless. So now came to an end the silent war between the journalist and the general that had waged all throughout the Owen Stanley campaign. And as it turned out, it was not the general, but the journalist who was sacked.
I pay on success, and no man's perfect. I don't think Blamey was, but who is?
By now, fresh Australian troops were in pursuit of the Japanese. In more ruthless fighting, they were chased back to the north coast. On November 1, Blamey removed Wilmot's accreditation as a war correspondent, correctly accusing him of having attempted to undermine his authority. On November 2, Kokoda was retaken. A week later, an unchecked Blamey called to parade at a place called Koitaki the men who had saved Australia and unequivocally condemned them.
And we went to this parade where Blamey came down to speak to us. And he gave a great dissertation to our troops about it's the rabbit that runs that gets shot. And he all the time was virtually saying that cowards can't live.
It stirred them up like I've never seen troops stirred up before. And personally, I reckon Blamey was lucky to get out of it alive that night.
Koitaki really is that point where it becomes so obvious of the absolute ignorance of the Australian High Command, the Allied High Command. MacArthur, Blamey, New Guinea Force, the politicians. No one knew what Maroubra Force had accomplished up there. Koitaki's the point where the panic has really come to the fore.
It was a shameful, call it cowardly, attack on men that had given their all.
Chester Wilmot's friend, the fellow correspondent Kenneth Slessor, wrote a poem about Blamey saying the men had given him everything except respect.
I'm getting me photo took by a cannon. Yeah.
Wilmot was never able to tell the full story as he was to threaten. He took a job with the BBC and was later killed in an air crash. The men of Maroubra Force have been inclined to keep quiet about all this too. They say you had to be there to understand. But they don't complain. On the Owen Stanleys, they were fighting for neither career nor promotion.
Well, from what I can remember, when it was all over, well, we thought, well, we survived. And we, didn't blame anyone. I didn't know anything about war. I don't think any of the others did either. And we thought all wars were like that. Badly managed.
On the Owen Stanleys, they overcame the lot: inexperience, the jungle, the enemy, and weakness in some of their own leaders. They fought without the world watching, with less of the pointless bravery of the old Anzacs, but with all their forebears' tenacity and some mature good sense. Without exception, they call themselves ordinary Australians.
Keep it straight there. You're right now? Yeah. That's straight, Ernie. That's straight, yeah.
I'm killing the Japs and they're stacking them up. Well, the Japs had a mountain. Yeah, I used to hate them.
And we're setting up a signpost where they can talk to Moresby with lights and
Good to see you. Good to see you, mate.
Hello, Mac. How are you? What, all right?
They don't like to be beaten. For all that they're sometimes a bit cocky and a bit boastful. It's more a charade. They're simply a bit understated in a lot of ways. They're not boasters, they pretend to be, but when they've had a few schooners. But given ordinary circumstances, the 39th were ordinary Australians. But we're proud to be one of them. They're family. They're all family. My boys, they'll always be all family. I think we love them all and each other. That's the incredible bond there is. You see, your temper's steel, and that bond was tempered in that crucible of pain and fear and suffering. It was tempered beyond breaking. They're my boys, those Australians.